the walls that shaped the world. In 1283, King Edward I of England spent what would amount to roughly $300 million in today's money on a single building project. Not a cathedral, not a palace, a castle. Caernarfon Castle, with its massive polygonal towers and walls thick enough to drive a cart through, was designed to be unconquerable. It was a statement in stone, a declaration that whoever held those walls held Wales. And for a while, it worked. But here is the part that still puzzles military historians. By the time the 15th century rolled around, castle building across Europe had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Concentric walls, murder holes, killing grounds designed with almost mathematical precision. Fortification design had never been more advanced, and yet within a single generation, almost all of it became obsolete. Not gradually, not through slow decay, practically overnight. The question is, why did centuries of fortress engineering collapse so completely, so fast? And how did that catastrophic failure lead to something entirely unexpected? Fortifications that were, in many ways, more ingenious than anything that came before. We'll get there, but first we need to go back, way back, to understand what walls meant in the first place, before we settle in. If you enjoy what we do here, a like or subscribe genuinely helps us keep making these long-form histories. And if you've got stories about fortifications, maybe you served at a Cold War installation, or your parents told you about the bunkers during the Blitz, or you've walked the walls of a medieval castle on holiday, I'd especially love to hear about it in the comments below. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A journey through stone and earth, through arrow slits and gun ports, from the first walls humans ever raised to the concrete bunkers buried beneath the fields of France. The story of fortification is, at its heart, a story about fear, about what people were afraid of and what they were willing to build and sacrifice to feel safe. And that story begins not with castles, but with mud. Chapter 2. Before the castle, why humans first built walls. Long before anyone dreamed of a castle, long before iron or bronze or even copper tools, people were building walls. The oldest known fortification in the world sits in Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, and it dates to roughly 9,000 years before the Common Era. That's not a typo. 9,000 years before the Common Era, we're talking about a stone wall and tower built by people who hadn't yet invented pottery. They were still figuring out agriculture, still transitioning from hunting and gathering, and yet someone looked around and said, essentially, we need a wall. The Tower of Jericho stands roughly 8 meters tall, built from undressed stone blocks fitted together without mortar. Inside, a narrow staircase spirals upward, claustrophobic, dark, and clearly designed for something more than decoration. Whether it was meant to defend against raiders, to watch for floods, or simply to impress the neighbors, scholars still argue about. What they don't argue about is this: it worked. People kept living behind those walls for thousands of years. The impulse to fortify, to put something solid between yourself and whatever might be coming, that's as old as civilization itself. And the pattern that emerged in those early millennia is the same pattern that would repeat for the next 11,000 years. Someone builds a wall, someone else figures out how to get over it, under it, or through it. So the wall gets higher, thicker, and then someone invents a better way to break it. It's an arms race, and it never really ended. It just changed materials. The Romans understood this better than anyone. They didn't just build walls, they built systems. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 miles across northern England, wasn't simply a barrier. It was a customs checkpoint, a military highway, a chain of garrisons, and a statement of imperial power, all wrapped in dressed stone. The Romans knew that a wall alone means nothing. It's what you do behind the wall and how you respond when someone tests it that matters. We'll come back to that idea, because it turns out to be the single most important lesson in the entire history of fortification, and the one that military planners kept forgetting at the worst possible moments. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can talk about star forts and bunker complexes and reinforced concrete, we need to talk about the structure that dominated European warfare for roughly 500 years. The castle, and more specifically, how a pile of dirt and some wooden stakes became one of the most effective military technologies in human history. Chapter 3. The Motte and Bailey, Fortification Made Fast. When William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in 1066, he brought with him something that would reshape the English landscape for centuries. Not just soldiers, though he brought plenty of those. He brought a building technique, the Motte and Bailey. The concept was almost absurdly simple. Dig a big ditch, pile the earth into a mound, that's your motte. Build a wooden tower on top, then enclose a yard at the base, that's your bailey, with a wooden fence and another ditch. The whole thing could be thrown up in a matter of weeks, sometimes days if you were in a hurry and had enough laborers, which William did because he'd just conquered an entire country and had no shortage of people he could press into service. What made the Motte and Bailey so devastatingly effective wasn't sophistication. It was speed and psychology. Within weeks of arriving in a hostile territory, a Norman lord could have a fortified position that dominated the surrounding countryside. The height of the motte, usually between 5 and 15 meters, gave defenders a commanding view and forced any attacker to fight uphill, which anyone who has ever tried to run up a muddy slope in heavy gear will tell you is roughly as enjoyable as it sounds. But the real genius was the message it sent. That castle on the hill wasn't just a military position. It was a constant, visible reminder of who was in charge. Every Anglo-Saxon farmer working his fields could look up and see it. Every morning when the mist lifted, there it was. You didn't need to station an enormous garrison inside. A handful of armored knights behind those walls could control an entire region, because the population knew that attacking uphill against trained cavalry, sheltering behind fortifications was, to put it in military terms, tactically inadvisable. William built something like 500 of these across England in the 20 years following the conquest. 500. That's roughly one every 2 weeks, and it fundamentally changed the relationship between ruler and ruled. Before the Normans, Anglo-Saxon lords had fortified halls, certainly, but nothing designed with this level of deliberate military control in mind. The Motte and Bailey turned the English countryside into a network of strongpoints, each one a node of Norman power projected across a hostile landscape. Now there was one rather obvious problem with building a fortress out of wood. It burns, and the people trying to take your castle knew it burned. Fire arrows, bundles of dry straw, pots of fat. Anything combustible could be hurled or launched at a timber fortification, and once the palisade caught fire, your defensive advantage went up in smoke. Quite literally. Which is why, over the course of the late 11th and 12th centuries, those timber towers started coming down and stone started going up. The White Tower in London, begun around 1078, was one of the first and most dramatic examples. A massive stone keep built from imported Caen limestone that announced Norman permanence with every block. But here's the thing about building in stone. It wasn't simply a material upgrade. It was a completely different approach to warfare, to governance, and to the landscape itself. Timber was temporary. Timber said, "We're here for now." Stone said, "We're here forever." And that shift, from wood to stone, from temporary to permanent, set off a chain reaction in fortification design that would accelerate for the next 4 centuries, producing some of the most extraordinary defensive architecture the world has ever seen. We'll talk about concentric castles shortly, and about why a Welsh prince's desperate resistance forced Edward I to spend that staggering fortune we mentioned at the beginning. But first, let's look at how the simple stone keep, the tower, became the centerpiece of medieval military thinking, because understanding the keep is understanding the entire philosophy of medieval defense, and that philosophy, for all its elegance, contained a fatal flaw that no amount of stone could fix. Chapter 4. The Stone Keep, Medieval Engineering at its finest. The Stone Keep, the donjon, the Great Tower, call it what you will, was the beating heart of the medieval castle, and the men who designed them understood something fundamental about defense that we sometimes overlook in our age of satellites and guided missiles. Height matters, thickness matters, but what matters most is making the attacker's job as miserable, as slow, and as costly as possible at every single step. Consider how a typical stone keep worked. The entrance was almost never at ground level. It sat on the first or second floor, reached by an external staircase that could be destroyed or withdrawn. So, before you even got to the door, you had to climb while exposed to whatever the defenders chose to drop on you, and they had options. Boiling water, heated sand, plain old rocks, which are remarkably effective when dropped from 10 meters onto someone wearing a metal helmet. Once inside, if you made it inside, the corridors were narrow, the staircases spiraled clockwise. That clockwise spiral wasn't an accident. It meant that a right-handed attacker fighting his way upward had his sword arm cramped against the central column, while the right-handed defender above him had his sword arm free against the open side. Someone thought about that. Someone designed a staircase specifically to give the home team an advantage in hand-to-hand combat, and that level of deliberate, calculated cruelty disguised as architecture is, frankly, rather impressive. The walls themselves were staggering in their dimensions. As Rochester, the walls of the keep measured over 3.5 meters thick at the base. 3.5 meters. That's thicker than most modern houses are wide. You could stand 2 grown men end to end inside the wall itself. And many castles had passages, chambers, and even garderobes, latrines, built directly into the thickness of the walls. Those who remember building Anderson shelters during the war, or even digging foxholes in the frozen ground of Korea, would appreciate what it means to hide inside something truly solid. But even Anderson shelters had nothing on these walls. But no wall, however thick, was invulnerable. In 1215, during the First Barons' War, King John laid siege to Rochester Castle. When his trebuchets couldn't breach those enormous walls, he resorted to mining, digging a tunnel under the southeast corner tower, shoring it up with wooden beams, and then filling the tunnel with the fat of 40 pigs and setting it alight. The fire burned out the supports, the tunnel collapsed, and the corner of the tower came down with it. 40 pigs. That was the price of breaching one of the strongest fortifications in England. The defenders retreated to the other half of the keep. It was divided by a cross wall, another deliberate defensive feature, and held out for weeks more. But the lesson was clear, and it sent shockwaves through the castle-building world. Square corners were vulnerable to mining, and that single observation would reshape every castle built for the next 2 centuries. The solution: round towers. Curved walls deflect projectiles rather than absorbing their full impact at a flat surface. They eliminate the blind spots that square corners create, where attackers could huddle unobserved, and they're far harder to mine, because there's no corner to target. No single point where the removal of a few stones cascades into structural failure. After Rochester, round towers became the standard across Europe, and with that shift, the medieval castle entered its most sophisticated phase. A phase that would culminate in the astonishing concentric fortresses of Edward I, the most expensive and most ambitious defensive structures the medieval world ever produced. But we'll get to Edward's masterpieces in a moment. Because first we need to understand something about the people who actually lived inside these walls, and what daily life in a medieval castle was really like, because it wasn't, despite what the films suggest, particularly glamorous. Chapter 5. Life behind the walls, what castles were really like. So what was it actually like living inside one of these places? Let's not romanticize it. The Great Hall, the largest room in the castle where everyone ate, many slept, and most of the daily business was conducted, was draughty, smoky, and loud. Before chimneys became standard in the 13th century, the fire sat in the middle of the hall, and the smoke was meant to drift upward through a louvre in the roof. In practice, it drifted everywhere, into your food, into your clothes, into your lungs. Those who remember houses before central heating, and many in this audience do, will have some frame of reference, but imagine that and then remove the insulation. Remove the double glazing. Remove the carpets, the weather stripping, every modern barrier between you and the winter air. What you're left with is a stone box, and stone is a magnificent conductor of cold. Sleeping in a castle bedchamber during an English winter was, by all surviving accounts, an exercise in endurance. You piled on furs, you drew the bed curtains, and you resigned yourself to seeing your own breath until spring. Luxury. Thy name is a straw mattress and a draughty arrow slit. The kitchen was another matter entirely. Castle kitchens were often built as separate structures or pushed against the curtain wall, partly to reduce the fire risk and partly because the heat they generated was extraordinary. Those fireplaces were large enough to roast an entire ox, and someone had to tend them. The women who ran medieval castle kitchens, and they were predominantly women, a fact that often gets overlooked, managed an operation that would impress any military quartermaster, feeding a garrison of 50 to 100 people 3 times a day with nothing more than open flame, iron pots, and whatever the surrounding countryside could supply. No refrigeration, no thermometers, no timers, just experience, instinct, and the certain knowledge that if dinner was late, the Lord would hear about it. But the single most important feature of any castle wasn't the walls or the tower or the hall. It was the well. Without water, no fortification could hold for more than a few days. Castle builders went to extraordinary lengths to secure water supply, drilling wells to solid rock, sometimes to depths of over 100 meters. At Dover Castle, the well shaft reaches nearly 400 feet into the chopped cliffs. The engineering required to drill that deep with medieval tools, iron chisels, muscle power, and patience measured in years, is quietly astonishing. Those who worked in mining or oil drilling will appreciate the scale of it. Everyone else can simply marvel. And then there was sanitation. Or rather, there wasn't. The garderobe, the castle latrine, was typically a small stone chamber built into the thickness of the wall or projecting out from it on corbels, with a hole that dropped whatever you contributed directly down the exterior of the castle wall, or into the moat. The word garderobe itself means wardrobe. People hung their clothes in these chambers because the ammonia fumes were believed to keep moths away. Whether it worked is debatable. Whether it smelled is not. Better left to the imagination, that one. But for all their discomforts, castles worked. They worked because the basic arithmetic of medieval siege warfare heavily favored the defender. A garrison of 50 men behind solid walls could hold off an army of several hundred, sometimes for months. The attacker had to feed his army in the field, maintain supply lines, keep morale up through rain and cold and disease, all while the defenders sat behind their walls, warm-ish, fed from stored provisions, and waiting for either relief or winter, whichever came first to drive the besiegers away. The mathematics of it was straightforward. A well-provisioned castle could hold for months. The besieging army, exposed to weather, disease, and the constant drain of keeping men fed in the field, often broke first. Dysentery alone probably ended more sieges than any battering ram. This is why sieges, not battles, were the dominant form of medieval warfare. Open field battles were relatively rare. They were risky, unpredictable, and a single bad afternoon could cost you everything. But a siege? A siege was methodical. Surround the castle, cut off supply, and wait, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. The longest recorded medieval siege, Chateau Gaillard in 1203 and 4, lasted roughly 6 months before the French finally broke through. Chateau Gaillard is worth pausing on, because it shows just how seriously medieval lords took their fortifications. Richard the Lionheart built it in a single year, an astonishing feat of military engineering, and reportedly declared, "How beautiful she is, my 1-year-old castle." He designed it personally, incorporating everything he'd learned about fortification during the Crusades, and yet even Richard's masterpiece fell. Because no wall, no matter how cleverly designed, can hold forever if the garrison runs out of food, if relief doesn't come, if the attacker is patient enough and resourceful enough. That tension between the strength of walls and the weakness of the people behind them runs through the entire history of fortification like a crack in the masonry. And it was precisely because sieges were so central to medieval warfare that castle design kept evolving. Every siege taught lessons. Every failure prompted innovation. And nowhere was that process of innovation more dramatic or more expensive than in the concentric castles of Edward I. Chapter 6. The Concentric Castle. Edward I's masterpieces. £13 million. That's what Edward I spent in the money of his day on his castle building program in North Wales. Adjusted for inflation, the figure is almost incomprehensible, somewhere between 200 million and 300 million in today's currency, depending on which economist you ask. and every penny of it was spent on a single idea: the concentric castle. The concept was elegant and ruthless. Instead of relying on a single wall and a central keep, the concentric castle wrapped the entire fortress in 2 rings of walls: an outer wall, lower and thinner, and an inner wall, taller and more massive. The space between them was the killing ground. Any attacker who breached the outer wall found himself trapped in a narrow corridor, exposed to fire from both sides, with no cover and nowhere to hide. Archers on the taller inner wall could fire over the heads of those on the outer wall, creating overlapping fields of fire that made the gap between the walls a place of methodical destruction. Those who remember the great construction projects of the 40s and 50s, the Hoover Dam, the interstate highway system, the post-war housing boom, will recognize the scale, if not the methods. Edward's castle building campaign was the largest construction project in Britain since the Romans left. At Caernarfon alone, records show that over 2,500 labourers were employed at peak construction. Drawn from across England, masons, carpenters, diggers, smiths, and the women who kept them all fed and clothed. Entire communities were effectively conscripted and relocated to the wilds of North Wales to build a king's ambition in stone. The gatehouse in particular had evolved into something extraordinary. In earlier castles, the gate was the weakest point, the one place where there had to be an opening in the wall. By Edward's time, it had been transformed into the strongest. The gatehouse at Harlech, for instance, contained 2 portcullises, multiple sets of heavy doors, murder holes in the ceiling for dropping projectiles onto anyone trapped inside, and arrow loops covering every angle. Getting through a concentric castle's gatehouse was like running a gauntlet designed by someone who took profound professional satisfaction in making that gauntlet as unpleasant as possible. Remember that question from the opening about why centuries of fortress engineering collapsed so suddenly? We're getting closer to the answer. But to understand the catastrophe, you first have to appreciate how good these castles were, because the concentric castle, at its best, was very nearly impregnable with the technology of its time, the mathematics of medieval siege warfare. The cost in men, money, and time required to take a well-built concentric fortress defended by a competent garrison made direct assault almost suicidal and prolonged siege ruinously expensive. Edward's castles in Wales were never taken by storm in their prime, not one. Those of you who served in the military, or whose fathers or mothers served, particularly anyone who understood Cold War strategic thinking, will recognize what Edward built. It wasn't just castles. It was a network. The Iron Ring, historians call it, a chain of mutually supporting fortresses, each positioned to control key terrain, river crossings, harbors, mountain passes, so that no single point could be attacked in isolation. Take one castle and the garrisons of 3 others could respond. Each fortress was, in effect, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, permanently stationed at a strategic choke point, the medieval equivalent of NATO's forward-deployed forces along the Iron Curtain. If you served at a Cold War installation, or remember the tension of those years, I'd love to hear how that experience colors your view of these older fortifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Perspectives from people who've lived inside defensive systems are invaluable. What's easy to forget looking at these places today, at their ruined walls and empty courtyards, is that they were communities, not just garrisons, but places where people were born, married, raised children, worshipped, and died. The castle chapel, often beautifully decorated, even in the most austere military fortress, was where soldiers prayed before battle and families gave thanks after. Women managed households that functioned as self-contained towns, overseeing kitchens, laundries, infirmaries, and stores. Children grew up playing in the shadow of murder holes and arrow loops, probably not thinking twice about the grim purpose of the architecture around them. The same way children on military bases during the Cold War grew up thinking missile silos were perfectly normal features of the landscape. The smith's forge rang from dawn until dusk. Horseshoes, arrowheads, door hinges, portcullis chains, nails by the thousand. A castle consumed iron the way a modern factory consumes electricity. The carpenter was equally vital, maintaining everything from siege engines to bed frames to the timber scaffolding needed for wall repairs. These were skilled tradespeople, and their workshops within the castle walls represented centuries of accumulated practical knowledge, the kind of craftsmanship that older generations understand intuitively, because they grew up in a world where things were still made by hand, where you knew your blacksmith and your carpenter by name. The women who served as healers within castle walls, and they were overwhelmingly women, practiced a form of medicine that was, by modern standards, rudimentary but often effective. Herbal poultices, bone setting, wound binding, the knowledge of which plants reduced fever and which eased pain. This was practical wisdom passed from mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice, and it saved countless lives. Those who remember military nurses, whether the walks and waves of the Second World War or the field nurses in Korea, would recognize the same combination of competence, compassion, and willingness to work under conditions that would make most people flinch. And yet, for all their brilliance, for all the millions spent and the thousands of lives devoted to their construction, Edward's concentric castles, and every castle in Europe, were about to become obsolete, not because someone built a better siege tower, not because a new tactic emerged for storming walls, but because of a substance that had been invented centuries earlier on the other side of the world, and was now, finally, about to arrive in European warfare in a form that changed everything. Gunpowder. And what gunpowder did to the castle is one of the most dramatic technological disruptions in military history. We'll get to that next, and to the frantic, ingenious response that fortress designers came up with when they realized their walls were suddenly made of paper. Chapter 7. Gunpowder changes everything. The Chinese invented gunpowder sometime around the 9th century, possibly earlier. For hundreds of years, it remained primarily a weapon of psychological terror. Fireworks, fire arrows, crude grenades designed to frighten as much as to harm. The technology drifted westward along the Silk Road, appearing in the Islamic world by the 13th century and in Europe not long after, but it took time, decades, before anyone figured out how to make it genuinely useful against fortifications. The early European cannon were, to put it charitably, unreliable. Wrought iron bombards held together with iron hoops had an alarming tendency to explode, sometimes with consequences more devastating for the gunners than for the besieged. The stone balls they fired were heavy but brittle, and the weapons themselves were so massive they could barely be moved. An early bombard might weigh several tons, take hours to load, and need to cool between firings. Compared to a well-designed trebuchet, the advantages weren't immediately obvious. James II of Scotland was among those who learned this lesson fatally. In 1460, while besieging Roxburgh Castle, he stood too close to one of his own cannon when it exploded and was killed instantly. The king done in by his own artillery. It was that kind of era. The technology was advancing faster than anyone's ability to use it safely. But then two things happened in quick succession. First, founders learned to cast cannon from bronze rather than hammering them from iron, and bronze cannon was stronger, lighter, and far less likely to kill their own crews. Second, someone figured out that iron cannonballs, though harder to manufacture, were denser and more destructive than stone ones. By the early 15th century, cannon had improved enough to be genuinely dangerous to masonry, and the improvement didn't stop. Each decade brought better powder, better metallurgy, better gun carriages. Those who lived through the rapid technological change of the 20th century, from biplanes to jets in a single generation, will recognize the pace. New weapons outran the defenses designed to stop them, and the people caught in between paid the price. And then came 1453, and the event that changed fortification forever. The walls of Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years. The Theodosian walls, a triple defensive system of moat, outer wall and inner wall, stretching roughly 6.5 kilometers across the landward approach, were the most famous fortification in the world. They had repelled Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders, and every other army that had tried to breach them since the 5th century. They were, by any measure, the finest example of classical fortification ever built. Sultan Mehmed II brought 69 cannon to the siege of Constantinople. The largest, built by a Hungarian founder named Vauban, was over 5 meters long and fired stone balls weighing over half a ton. It could only fire 7 times a day because it needed hours to cool between shots. but 7 shots a day was enough. Over the course of 6 weeks, those cannons systematically demolished walls that had resisted everything the medieval world could throw at them for a millennium. On the 29th of May, 1453, the Ottomans broke through. Constantinople fell. Byzantine Empire, a continuous political entity stretching back to Rome itself, ended in a morning of rubble and smoke, and the lesson was immediately devastatingly clear to every military mind in Europe. The news spread across the continent like a shockwave. If Constantinople's walls, the greatest fortification in the world, tested and proven over 1,000 years, could fall to cannon, then no castle, no city wall, no fortification in Christendom was safe. Walls tall, proud, vertical walls of the kind that had defined defensive architecture for thousands of years were finished. A cannon could do in hours what a medieval siege army would have struggled to achieve in months. The higher the wall, the more vulnerable it was, because height gave the cannonball a longer surface to strike and a taller structure to topple. The very thing that had made castles strong, their towering, imposing stone walls, had become their greatest weakness. Remember, at the beginning we asked why centuries of fortress engineering collapsed so completely, so fast. Here's where it all comes together. It wasn't that castle builders were incompetent, quite the opposite. The Concentric castle was a masterpiece of defensive design, perfected over centuries of trial and error. The problem was that every innovation in castle design had been an answer to the same basic threat: men with muscle-powered weapons trying to get over, under, or through a wall. Battering rams, siege towers, catapults, mining, all operated on the same fundamental physics, and medieval walls had evolved specifically to defeat those physics. Gunpowder changed the physics. A cannon didn't care how thick your wall was if it was vertical. The ball would strike, crack the masonry, and eventually bring it down through accumulated structural damage. Height, which had been an advantage for millennia, became a liability, and the rate of improvement in artillery technology was breathtaking. Within a single generation after Constantinople, cannon had become mobile enough to be dragged from siege to siege, powerful enough to breach any medieval wall, and cheap enough that any monarch worth his crown could afford a siege train. The entire strategic landscape of Europe shifted in the span of a few decades, and that, in military history, is practically overnight. When the French King Charles VIII marched into Italy in 1494 with a modern siege train, he reduced fortresses that had stood for centuries in a matter of days, sometimes hours. The Italian city-states watched in horror as their ancient walls crumbled like dry biscuits. It was a military revolution, and like most revolutions, it was terrifying for those on the receiving end. Chapter 8. The Trace Italienne, How Engineers Fought Back. But here is where the story takes its unexpected turn, the turn we hinted at in the opening, because the death of the castle didn't lead to the death of fortification. It led to something entirely new. Something that, in its own way, was more ingenious, more mathematically precise, and more costly than anything the medieval world had produced. The response came from Italy, naturally. The peninsula that had suffered most from Charles VIII's invasion and had the most urgent reason to figure out a solution. And the solution they developed was so radical, so different from everything that had come before, that it reshaped not just military architecture but urban planning, mathematics, and the very geography of European cities for the next 3 centuries. They called it the Trace Italienne, the Italian trace, and its fundamental insight was devastatingly simple. If cannon made tall walls a liability, then make your wall short. If vertical surfaces invited direct hits, then slope your walls so cannonballs deflected upward and over. If stone shattered under bombardment, then pile earth behind it to absorb the impact. And if a medieval castle's weakness was its blind spots, the dead ground at the base of a wall where defenders couldn't see or shoot, then design your fortress so that every inch of wall was covered by fire from somewhere else. The arrow-shaped bastion was the key. Each bastion projected outward from the main wall like the point of a star. Defenders on one bastion could fire along the face of the curtain wall to the next bastion, and the defenders there could return the favor. This meant that any attacker trying to scale the wall was exposed to flanking fire from both sides simultaneously. There was no dead ground, no blind spots, no safe approach. The geometry itself was the weapon. It was mathematics as military science. The angles of the bastions had to be calculated precisely. Too acute and the bastion was weak. Too obtuse and the flanking fire didn't cover the adjacent wall. The distance between bastions had to match the effective range of the weapons positioned on them. Too far apart and gaps appeared in the fire coverage. Too close and you wasted resources. Every dimension was a calculated compromise, and the best fortress engineers of the 16th century, men like Saint-Michel, the Sangallo family, and eventually the great French engineer Vauban, were as much mathematicians as they were builders. The Motte Bailey had been a pile of dirt and some sharp sticks. The Trace Italienne was trigonometry with a budget. Those who served in the military will recognize the principle immediately. Defense in depth. The Trace Italienne didn't rely on a single wall. It relied on layers. First, the glacis, a long, gentle slope of bare earth stretching outward from the fortress, designed to expose approaching troops to fire while its shallow angle deflected cannonballs harmlessly overhead. Then the covered way, a sheltered path where defenders could position themselves outside the main wall. Then the ditch, wide, deep, and overlooked from above. Then the scarp wall, thick, sloped, backed by tons of packed earth that absorbed cannonball impacts like a pillow absorbs a punch. And finally, the rampart where cannon and muskets waited. An attacker didn't face a wall. He faced a system, and each layer of that system had to be overcome in sequence under fire. Before the next could even be approached, the mathematics of it were almost identical to the concentric castle. Multiple defensive lines, overlapping fields of fire, no safe ground, but adapted to the age of gunpowder. And just as the concentric castle had made sieges longer and more expensive, the Trace Italienne made sieges agonizingly slow, where a medieval castle might fall to cannon in days. A well-designed star fort could hold for weeks or months, even against modern artillery. Siege warfare became a mathematical exercise. Approach trenches dug in zigzag patterns to avoid flanking fire. Parallels established at calculated distances. Batteries positioned at precise angles. The science of fortification and the science of siege became mirror images of each other, and both required engineers as much as soldiers. The cost was staggering. A medieval castle, even Edward's most expensive, was a single fortified point. A Trace Italian fortress could encompass an entire city, with walls running for miles, each section requiring the same mathematical precision and the same enormous quantities of earth, brick, and stone. The Dutch, fighting their 80-year war of independence against Spain, fortified their town so extensively that the entire landscape of the Low Countries was reshaped, canals dug, fields flooded, towns ringed with bastioned walls that turned the Netherlands into one of the most heavily fortified regions on Earth. It was a new kind of warfare, one that would have been unrecognizable to the men who built Motte Bailey castles. Slower, more expensive, more scientific, but no less brutal, and it would dominate European military thinking for the next 200 years, reaching its ultimate expression in the work of one man who perfected the science of both building and breaking fortresses, Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, the greatest military engineer who ever lived, and the man who turned siege warfare into something very close to an exact science. The castle was dead. Long live the fortress, and the story of that fortress, from the fields of Flanders to the beaches of Normandy, was only just beginning. Chapter 9. Vauban. The man who perfected the fortress. Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban was born in 1633 in a small village in Burgundy, and by the time he died in 1707, he had personally designed or rebuilt over 150 fortresses, conducted more than 50 sieges, and fundamentally transformed the art of both building and breaking fortifications. If that sounds like an impossibly productive career, it was. The man was, by any reasonable measure, a genius, and the kind of genius who also happened to work approximately 18 hours a day for most of his adult life. What made Vauban extraordinary wasn't just that he built fortresses. Plenty of engineers did that. It was that he approached both fortification and siege warfare as problems to be solved through systematic method. He didn't just design walls. He designed systems, integrated defensive networks where every element supported every other, where the fall of one position was anticipated and planned for, where even retreat was engineered into the design. More than that, he thought in terms of national strategy. Louis XIV's France was surrounded by potential enemies on every border, and Vauban's solution was the pré carré, the dueling field, a double line of fortresses along every frontier, positioned so that an invading army could never advance without leaving unreduced fortresses in its rear, threatening its supply lines. It was Edward I's Iron Ring writ large across an entire nation. His fortresses were designed in 3 systems of increasing complexity, each building on the first system. His early work placed bastions at the corners with simple ravelins protecting the curtain walls between them, already sophisticated by any standard. The second system added detached bastions and counterguards in front of the main walls, creating additional layers that an attacker had to fight through. The third system, his final evolution, was so complex that some military historians have spent entire careers simply trying to understand all its interlocking elements. But Vauban's greatest contribution wasn't any single fortress. It was his approach to siege warfare itself. Before Vauban, sieges were frequently bloody, chaotic affairs. Commanders throwing men at walls and hoping for the best. Vauban turned the siege into a methodical process with predictable timelines and, crucially, predictable casualties. His system of parallel trenches. 3 successive trench lines dug at increasing proximity to the fortress, connected by zigzag approach trenches, became the standard method of siege for the next 2 centuries. It was slow, methodical, and remarkably predictable. Vauban could estimate, before a siege began, roughly how many days it would take to reduce a fortress of a given size and design, and he was usually right within a day or 2. Military science had rarely been so scientific. The first parallel was established at roughly 600 meters from the fortress, beyond effective musket range. From there, zigzag approach trenches crept forward to the second parallel at roughly 300 meters, where breaching batteries could begin their work. Then the third parallel, close enough to launch an assault. Each step was calculated, each trench line wider and deeper than necessity demanded. Because Vauban, unlike many commanders of his era, genuinely cared about minimizing the loss of his own men. He once wrote that a good siege was one where the commander spent earth freely and blood sparingly. Not every general shared that philosophy, but the ones who followed Vauban's methods lost fewer soldiers. The numbers were clear on that. Vauban died in 1707, having served the French crown for over 50 years. He left behind more than 150 fortresses, a standardized system of siege warfare, and a legacy so profound that virtually every military engineer for the next 2 centuries worked in his shadow. He also left behind something less tangible but equally important. The idea that fortification was not merely construction but calculation, that the strength of a wall could be expressed as a mathematical relationship between angles, distances, and firepower. That defense was a science, not an art. It was a profound shift in thinking, and its influence extends far beyond the walls he built. But for all its mathematical elegance, Vauban's system contained its own paradox. He had made fortresses so strong that they could only be taken by his own siege methods, and his siege methods were so effective that any fortress, no matter how well designed, would eventually fall. The equation was simple. Given enough time, enough trenches, and enough cannon, the attacker would win. The fortress could delay that outcome. Weeks, sometimes months, but couldn't prevent it. Fortification had become a question of buying time, not of creating impregnability. And that shift in thinking, from this wall will stop them, to this wall will slow them down long enough for something else to happen, would define every defensive structure built from that point forward, including the ones your generation remembers. Chapter 10. From Fortress to Field, Why Walls Went Underground. Something strange happened to fortification in the 19th century. It didn't disappear, not exactly, but it changed so fundamentally that a medieval castle builder would barely have recognized it. The great permanent fortresses of the Vauban era continued to be maintained and updated, but the nature of warfare itself was shifting underneath them. Armies were getting bigger, much bigger, and faster, and the weapons they carried were evolving at a pace that made the gunpowder revolution look leisurely by comparison. Napoleon changed the calculus. His armies were so large, so mobile, and so aggressive that they could afford to leave garrisons watching enemy fortresses while the main force swept past and struck at the enemy's capital or field army directly. Fortresses that had once been strategically decisive, the keystones of Vauban's Précaré, became backwaters. A city under siege while the enemy army marched on Paris was a city that had already lost its strategic relevance. The great permanent fortress hadn't been defeated by a better weapon. It had been made irrelevant by a better strategy. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 proved the point brutally. Prussian Krupp guns, steel, rifled, breech-loading, systematically demolished France's Vauban-era fortresses. Strasbourg, Metz, Sedan. Cities that had been considered strongholds for 2 centuries fell like dominoes. France's humiliation was total, and a lesson was seared into the national consciousness. If France was to survive the next war, and everyone knew there would be a next war, it needed a new kind of fortification entirely. But technology wasn't finished with the fortress yet. The rifled cannon arrived in the mid-19th century, and it was to Vauban's masonry fortresses what the original smoothbore cannon had been to medieval castles. A fundamental disruption. Rifled barrels gave artillery accuracy at ranges previously unimaginable. Explosive shells replaced solid shot, meaning that each impact didn't just crack masonry but detonated inside it, shattering walls from within. Suddenly, the elegant stone-faced ramparts that Vauban had designed to absorb cannonball impacts were shattering like ceramic. The fortress builders had to adapt again, and this time the solution wasn't geometric. It was material, concrete, and steel. The fortresses that emerged in the late 19th century bore no resemblance to anything that had come before. Gone were the elegant geometric walls. Gone were the bastions and ravelins visible from miles away. In their place, squat, buried structures of reinforced concrete and hardened steel, designed to absorb explosive shell impacts and keep functioning. The French Serre de Rivière system, built after the humiliating defeat by Prussia in 1870, ringed France's eastern border with dozens of these modern forts, each one a self-contained fighting position with retractable armored turrets, underground barracks, ventilation systems, and ammunition magazines protected by meters of concrete. The engineering was remarkable. Fort Douaumont, the strongest of the Verdun forts, sat beneath 2.5 meters of concrete, topped by 3 meters of compacted earth and a layer of sand, designed to detonate incoming shells before they reached the concrete. Its retractable steel turret, a 75mm gun that could be raised to fire and lowered back into its armored housing in seconds, was operated by a crew of soldiers who lived entirely underground, eating, sleeping, and fighting in a subterranean world of corridors and chambers that felt more like a submarine than a castle. Those who served in Cold War bunkers or missile installations will recognize this world immediately. The underground corridors, the artificial light, the hum of ventilation systems, the feeling of being sealed inside the earth with tons of concrete between you and the sky. It's a long way from a Norman motte with a view of the countryside, but the principle is the same. Put something solid between yourself and the enemy. The materials changed, the fear didn't. If you worked in or around military installations during the Cold War, whether you maintained the systems, stood the watch, or just lived on a base that had bunkers somewhere nearby, I'd be curious to hear what it felt like. The concrete world of fortification didn't end in 1918. For many of you, it was daily life. Share those memories in the comments if you're inclined. And then came 1914, and with it, the strangest twist in the entire history of fortification. The moment when defensive architecture didn't evolve forward into something new, but seemed to collapse backward into something ancient, because the Western Front, with its 400 miles of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the English Channel, was in many ways a return to the oldest form of fortification there is, a ditch, with men in it, hiding from people trying to get at them. It happened almost by accident. The opening months of the Great War were a war of movement, sweeping advances, flanking maneuvers, the kind of mobile warfare that Napoleon would have recognized. But then the armies ran out of room to maneuver. Each side tried to outflank the other, racing northward toward the sea, and when they reached the channel, there was nowhere left to go. Both armies dug in, and once they dug in, neither could get the other out, because the technology of 1914, the machine gun, the rapid-fire rifle, barbed wire, and above all, modern artillery, had made attacking across open ground almost impossibly costly, while defending from a prepared position was devastatingly effective. The trench, 9,000 years of defensive engineering, and it came back to a ditch in the ground. Vauban would have understood the parallels immediately. The zigzag communication trenches, the successive lines of defense, the carefully positioned strong points. The Western Front was, in a very real sense, a Vauban siege frozen in time, with neither side able to complete the final assault. Except that instead of weeks, it lasted 4 years, and instead of hundreds of soldiers, it consumed millions. Those who served in Korea, who dug into frozen hillsides and held positions against determined assault, understood this kind of warfare in their bones. The Western Front took that experience and industrialized it, made it larger, longer, and more mechanical in its destruction than anything the world had seen before, and the lessons it taught about fortification, about what works, what doesn't, and what happens when technology makes defense stronger than attack, would echo through every conflict of the 20th century and beyond. We'll talk about those lessons next, and about the great fortress lines that grew out of the trenches, the Maginot Line, the Atlantic Wall, the Siegfried Line, fortifications on a scale that made even Vauban's Pré-Carré look modest, and the fatal familiar mistake that undermined them all. Chapter 11. The Maginot Line, Fortress as National Strategy. After the carnage of the Western Front, France made a decision that seemed, at the time, perfectly rational. If trenches and fortifications had held the German army at bay for 4 years, at a cost of over 1 million French lives, then surely a permanent, purpose-built defensive line would hold them indefinitely, and at far less human cost. The logic was straightforward. Build the strongest fortification in history along the German border, make it so formidable that no army would dare attack it directly. Force the enemy to find another way around, and if they did, be waiting for them. The result was the Maginot Line, and whatever you've heard about it, it was almost certainly more impressive than you think. Each major ouvrage was essentially a buried city, underground barracks for hundreds of soldiers, complete with bunks, showers, and mess halls. Diesel-powered electrical generators providing lighting, ventilation, and power for the turret mechanisms. Hospitals capable of performing surgery. Ammunition magazines deep enough underground to survive any bombardment then imaginable. And narrow-gauge electric railways connecting the fighting positions on the surface to the living quarters below, sometimes running for 1 kilometer or more through reinforced concrete tunnels. The cost was extraordinary. Roughly 3 billion francs, equivalent to perhaps 12 to 15 billion in today's dollars, but the French government considered it a bargain. The alternative was another war of attrition like 1914 to 18, with hundreds of thousands of young men fed into the trenches. If concrete could save lives, France was willing to pour concrete until the budget screamed. The soldiers stationed in the Maginot Line lived a peculiar existence. They were technically on the front line, yet they might go weeks without seeing daylight. Their routines were more submarine than infantry. Watches, maintenance schedules, equipment checks, the monotony of waiting inside a concrete shell for an attack that might never come. Those who served aboard ships, or who remember the long, quiet stretches of garrison duty between moments of activity, will recognize the rhythm. Boredom punctuated by drills, sustained by routine, and undercut by the nagging awareness that the machinery around you existed for one purpose, and you hoped it would never be needed. The engineering was superb. The retractable turrets could absorb direct hits from the heaviest German artillery and keep functioning. The air filtration systems could protect against poison gas, a lesson learned at terrible cost in the previous war. The overlapping fields of fire meant that every approach was covered by multiple positions. On its own terms, the Maginot Line was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Many military historians argue it was the finest static fortification ever constructed. And then the Germans went around it. In May of 1940, the Wehrmacht didn't attack the Maginot Line. They didn't need to. They pushed their armored divisions through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French High Command had dismissed as impossible for tanks, crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, and swept into France behind the Maginot Line, rendering it strategically useless in a matter of days. The garrisons inside the fortresses found themselves cut off, bypassed, and irrelevant while the rest of France collapsed around them. The breakthrough at Sedan wasn't just a tactical success. It was a philosophical refutation of everything the Maginot Line represented. Static defense, no matter how strong at the point of contact, couldn't cope with mobile warfare that chose not to make contact at all. The panzer divisions didn't overcome the fortification, they made it irrelevant. Just as Napoleon had done to Vauban's fortresses 140 years earlier, the lesson apparently needed repeating. The irony was almost unbearable. The Maginot Line's garrisons were among the last French units to surrender, and they did so under direct orders from their own government. The fortresses themselves were undefeated. Not one major ouvrage was taken by assault. The engineering had worked. The strategy hadn't. And here we return to that lesson from the very beginning of our story, the one the Romans understood and the one military planners kept forgetting. A wall alone means nothing. It's what you do behind the wall and how you respond when someone tests it that matters. The Maginot Line was the most expensive and most sophisticated demonstration of that principle in military history. The wall was perfect. The response to the enemy's actual strategy was catastrophic. Historians still debate whether the Maginot Line was a mistake. Some argue it did exactly what it was designed to do: channel the German attack northward away from the French heartland. The problem wasn't the fortifications themselves, but France's failure to extend them to the sea, and the catastrophic assumption that the Ardennes was tank-proof. Others argue that the money spent on concrete would have been better spent on tanks and aircraft. What's your take? Historians have argued both sides for 80 years now, and this audience has the life experience to weigh in. I'm curious. Let me know in the comments. Chapter 12. The Atlantic Wall. Hitler's concrete obsession. If the Maginot Line was the most sophisticated static fortification ever built, the Atlantic Wall was the most ambitious. Beginning in 1942, Hitler ordered the construction of a continuous defensive line stretching from northern Norway to the Spanish border. Over 5,000 kilometers of coastline fortified with bunkers, gun emplacements, obstacles, and minefields. The scale was staggering. Over 17 million cubic meters of concrete were poured. More than 1.2 million tons of steel were used, and much of the work was done by forced laborers. A fact that darkens the engineering achievement considerably. The organization taught employed, and that word requires heavy quotation marks, over 250,000 workers at the project's peak. French civilians conscripted under the service de travail obligatoire, prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. The concrete of the Atlantic Wall was mixed with suffering. That's a historical fact that deserves acknowledgement alongside any discussion of the engineering. Those who remember the home front during the Second World War, who understood what occupation and forced labor meant for the people of Europe, will recognize this for what it was. The philosophy behind the Atlantic Wall was simple and familiar. Stop the enemy on the beach, deny him a foothold, make the first few hundred meters of any amphibious assault so lethal that no force could survive the crossing. The bunkers were designed to withstand naval bombardment, their walls 2 to 3 meters of reinforced concrete, their embrasures angled to provide interlocking fields of fire across the beaches, underwater obstacles. Steel hedgehogs, concrete tetrahedra, mined stakes were placed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft at high tide. Behind the beaches, minefields and concrete strongpoints created a defensive depth that, on paper, looked impenetrable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was given command of the Atlantic Wall's most critical sectors in late 1943, understood that the battle would be won or lost in the first 24 hours. He drove his engineers relentlessly, demanding more obstacles, more mines, more concrete. He reportedly told his aides that the beach defenses must be so strong that the first wave of any invasion would be destroyed in the water. If the Allies got ashore and established a beachhead, the war was lost. He was right about the importance. He was wrong about the outcome. On the 6th of June 1944, the Atlantic Wall was tested. and the results were mixed in ways that tell us everything about the eternal tension between fortification and assault. At Omaha Beach, where the defenses were strongest and the terrain favored the defenders, the assault very nearly failed. American troops faced withering fire from concrete positions above the beach, and casualties were devastating. Over 2,000 men in a single morning. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. The wall doing exactly what it was designed to do. Those who served in Korea or Vietnam, or whose fathers landed on those beaches, know what it costs to assault a fortified position. The men at Omaha paid that price in the most concentrated way imaginable. Small unit leaders, sergeants and lieutenants mostly, eventually found ways through pushing up the bluffs between the strong points, finding gaps in the wire, flanking positions that the concrete embrasures couldn't cover. Individual courage and initiative did what no amount of preliminary bombardment could manage. The fortification was overcome not by a superior technology but by human determination applied at the critical point. But at other beaches, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, where the defenses were thinner, the preliminary bombardment more effective, or the tactical approach more creative, the wall was breached in hours. The Atlantic Wall, like the Maginot Line before it, suffered from the same fundamental problem. It was a line, and a line can be concentrated against at any point. The attacker chooses where to strike. The defender has to be strong everywhere, and no defender in history has ever been strong everywhere. Within a week, the Atlantic Wall was irrelevant. Within a month, the Allied armies had broken out of Normandy entirely. Over 17 million cubic meters of concrete. More than 1 million tons of steel. Years of construction by hundreds of thousands of workers, and it held for less than a day at most points along the invasion front. The wall was strong. The response to the enemy's actual assault, concentrated at specific points, preceded by overwhelming naval and air bombardment, supported by specialized armor and engineering, was inadequate. The same lesson repeated again. You'd think someone would have taken notes. And yet, and this is the part that complicates any simple narrative about the failure of fortification, the Atlantic Wall bunkers themselves were astonishingly durable. Many of the concrete casemates survived direct hits from naval guns that would have flattened any other structure on Earth. Some are still standing today, 80 years later, slowly sinking into the Normandy sand, but structurally intact. The concrete didn't fail. The strategy did. It's a distinction that matters, because the concrete bunker, stripped of its role as a static defensive line and reimagined as something more flexible, would go on to become the dominant form of military fortification for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. We'll finish tonight's journey with what came after: the Cold War bunkers, the modern fortification, and the question of whether walls still matter in an age of precision-guided missiles and satellite surveillance. But that's for our final chapter. Chapter 13. The Cold War Bunker, Fortification Against Annihilation. The Cold War took the principle of fortification to its logical and arguably its most terrifying conclusion. If the threat was nuclear annihilation, then the fortification had to survive nuclear annihilation, and that meant going deeper underground, behind more concrete, inside more steel than anything the world had ever built before. The Cold War fortification network was unlike anything before it. It wasn't a line drawn on a map, like the Maginot or the Atlantic Wall. It was a web layered across an entire continent, extending from Arctic radar stations in the Canadian wilderness to missile silos buried in the wheat fields of Nebraska. From command centers inside mountains to communication bunkers beneath the English countryside, every element served a different purpose. But they all shared the same underlying logic: survive the first strike, maintain the ability to respond, and by doing so, ensure the first strike never comes. Cheyenne Mountain, hollowed out of Colorado granite beginning in 1961, was and remains the most dramatic example. The complex sits behind blast doors that weigh 25 tons each. The buildings inside are mounted on over 1,000 enormous steel springs, each weighing about 1,000 pounds, designed to let the entire complex flex and bounce during a nuclear near-miss, rather than shaking itself apart. The mountain provides 1,500 feet of granite overhead. The facility has its own power plant. its own water supply, its own air filtration capable of scrubbing out radioactive fallout and chemical agents. It can operate sealed for 30 days. Those of you who served during the Cold War, whether you were stationed inside one of these installations, or maintained the equipment, or simply lived with the knowledge that such places existed, understand something that's difficult to convey to younger generations. The scale of Cold War fortification wasn't about defending against an army. It was about defending against the end of the world, the fear that drove 9,000-year-old Jericho to build its tower. The fear of what's coming over the horizon had been multiplied by a factor of millions, and the response was the same as it had always been. Build something. Put it between yourself and the threat. Hope it's enough. The engineering had changed beyond recognition. The impulse hadn't changed at all. But the Cold War also proved something else, something that echoed back through every era of fortification we've discussed tonight. The best fortification was the one that never had to be used. Cheyenne Mountain's purpose wasn't to survive a nuclear war. It was to make nuclear war less likely by ensuring that the United States could detect an incoming strike and respond, eliminating any advantage a first strike might offer. The bunker's role was deterrence. The wall existed not to withstand an assault, but to prevent one. And that idea, fortification as deterrent rather than as active defense, is arguably the oldest and most successful application of walls in human history. The castle on the hill that kept the peace by making rebellion too costly. Edward's iron ring that subdued Wales by making revolt futile. Vauban's pré carré that protected France simply by existing. The missile silo that protected the world by threatening to destroy it. Each one a different expression of the same ancient calculation. The wall works best when it never has to fight. Those who remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, who sat in living rooms and listened to the news and wondered whether the world would still be here tomorrow, understand deterrence at a visceral level that no history book can convey. If you lived through those 13 days in October of '62, or if you served in any capacity during the decades of Cold War readiness, your experience is history. And it's the kind of history that connects directly to every wall, every castle, every bunker we've talked about tonight. The impulse to protect. The hope that protection will never be needed. The knowledge that it must be there anyway. For some, the response was a backyard fallout shelter. Concrete and cinder block buried in the garden, stocked with canned goods and water. A private fortification against the unthinkable. Millions of American families built them or considered building them. The government distributed pamphlets on how to do it. 9,000 years after Jericho. Ordinary people were still digging holes and stacking stones. Or in this case, cinder blocks between themselves and whatever might be coming. The technology was modern. The impulse was ancient. And on both sides of the Atlantic, children practiced duck and cover drills in school basements that were, in their modest way, the same thing the keep had been to the medieval garrison. A place to shelter when the worst arrived. Those who built shelters, who did civil defense drills, who served on watch, who maintained the systems, or who simply endured the tension year after year, decade after decade, the low hum of anxiety that was the Cold War's background noise. Your stories matter. They're as much a part of the history of fortification as any castle or bunker. I'd be honored to hear them in the comments below. Chapter 14, Legacy, What Walls Still Mean. So where does that leave us? After 9,000 years of walls, mud brick, stone, earth, concrete, steel, after towers and keeps and bastions and bunkers, after the same arms race repeated across every century of recorded history, what have we learned? Perhaps the most remarkable thing is how little the fundamental principle has changed. A modern forward operating base in a conflict zone, surrounded by HESCO barriers which are literally just modern gabions filled with earth, uses the same defensive logic as a Roman marching camp, walls to stop direct fire, elevated positions for observation, controlled entry points, fields of fire cleared around the perimeter. The materials are different. The surveillance technology, cameras, drones, sensors would seem miraculous to a medieval garrison, but the underlying philosophy is identical. Create protected space in hostile territory and make the cost of attacking it higher than the attacker is willing to pay. Even in an age of precision-guided missiles and satellite surveillance, Of cyber warfare and drone strikes, the bunker endures. Governments still build hardened facilities underground. Military planners still factor defensive positions into their calculations. The form keeps changing, from wall to rampart to trench to bunker to hardened data center. But the function remains: protection. Time, the ability to absorb a blow and keep functioning long enough to respond. Those aren't obsolete concepts. They'll never be obsolete because the vulnerability they address is as fundamental as human conflict itself. And what of the old fortifications themselves? The castles and starforts and bunkers that still dot the landscapes of Europe and beyond. They endure, not as military installations, that purpose is long spent, but as something else. As monuments, as museums, as places where people come to stand on ancient walls and look out over the same countryside that medieval centuries once watched and feel something that's difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. A connection to the people who built these structures, who lived and fought and feared and hoped behind them. The stone remembers, even when the names are lost. The castle builders weren't foolish. The fortress engineers weren't wasting their time. The men who poured 17 million cubic meters of concrete into the Atlantic wall weren't deluded. They were all trying to solve the same problem. The oldest problem in human civilization. How do you protect what matters to you from those who would take it away? And every answer they came up with, from the first stone wall at Jericho to the last Hesco barrier placed in a modern combat zone, was an expression of the same stubbornly human conviction that something can be built that will hold, that a wall, a ditch, a mound of earth, something can keep the darkness out. Sometimes the wall held, sometimes it didn't, but the act of building it, the defiance, the ingenuity, the sheer stubborn refusal to accept vulnerability without a fight, that never stopped. It never will, because as long as people have something worth protecting, they'll keep building walls, and as long as people want what's behind those walls, they'll keep trying to get through them. The arms race between offense and defense, between the wall and the weapon, is as permanent a feature of human civilization as language or art. It's not a failure that we keep building walls that eventually fall. It's a testament to something in us that refuses to stop trying. The mason who cut stone for Edward's castles in Wales, the engineer who calculated bastion angles in Renaissance Italy, the soldier who filled sandbags on the Western Front, the construction worker who poured concrete for the Maginot Line. They were all, in their way, doing the same thing. They were saying this far, no further, not without a fight, not without cost. The story of fortification is, in the end, a story about us, about what we fear and what we value, about the lengths we'll go to for safety and the ingenuity we'll summon when safety is threatened, from a mud wall in Jericho to a granite mountain in Colorado, from a Norman motte in the English countryside to a concrete bunker sinking slowly into a Normandy beach. It's the same story, told across 9,000 years, in every material the earth provides. We sought it tonight with a king who spent $300 million on a castle, and a question. Why did centuries of fortress engineering collapse so suddenly? And we found the answer, not in the failure of the builders, but in the relentless creativity of the people trying to get past their walls. Every wall, no matter how strong, eventually meets a weapon it cannot withstand, but every weapon in turn inspires a new kind of wall. The cycle doesn't end, it transforms. And perhaps that's the most comforting thing about this whole story. Not that walls fall. They do. They always have. They always will. But that people keep building them anyway. Not out of naivety, but out of something deeper. The conviction that what's behind the wall, the homes, the families, the communities, the way of life is worth defending. Worth the effort, the expense, the ingenuity, the sacrifice. Worth piling stone upon stone, earth upon earth, concrete upon steel, generation after generation, from the dawn of civilization to the present day. And in the quiet of history, their walls still stand, some in ruins, some in memory, some in the very ground beneath our feet, if we're willing to look. If tonight's journey stirred memories, whether your own, your parents', or stories passed down across generations, I'd be honored if you shared them below. Those who served in any capacity, who built or maintained or simply lived within the shadow of fortifications. From castle tours to Cold War postings, your generation's perspective is irreplaceable. The comment section is yours. Now rest well, and I'll see you in the next one.